the goal of the company was literally to be an alternative to the current business model, like to step away from business as usual, which seemed to destroy the planet, and show an alternative.
Welcome to Skin as It Should Be, the podcast that takes an unfiltered look at skincare and the science behind it, with master chemist Trevor Steyn and creative professional Geoff Paton. In today's episode, you'll discover why your skincare brand's ethics could damage your skin. Hey Trevor, welcome back to another round of podcasts.
Thanks, Geoff.
When we first started working with you in the Esse brand, overwhelmingly it was seen as an organic brand by your therapists and also by the public in general. But we know that you're a microbiome skincare brand. And, you know, there in the gap was an interesting point for us to sort of delve into why and how. Maybe just tell us a little bit about your journey from inception of the brand to organic and now to the journey you're on now.
Yeah, I guess at the beginning of the company, I mean, it's a long time ago now, 2002. Yeah, I was a full-on hippie, and you know, I mean, we were living out in the middle of nowhere, growing our own food, and the goal of the company was literally to be an alternative to the current business model, like to step away from business as usual, which seemed to destroy the planet, and show an alternative. I think perhaps my drive for innovation pressed us beyond that, and that process kind of started in 2008 already, and really stepped up as the Human Microbiome Project started delivering its first results. So I guess at that point, you know, when we started, our point of difference was that we were certified organic, and in the early 2000s, that was a point of difference. And then as we moved on and the research progressed and we started focusing more and more on the professional channel, selling into, first of all, beauty schools and then onto therapists. Yeah, I guess that the drive toward efficacy became the primary drive, and the primary target of the research that underpinned the product. And I guess at that point, the research team was still maintained the core ethics, but it felt like we had a hell of a lot more to offer than just being organic. And I think what you guys picked up there, thank goodness, was that we hadn't really adjusted our messaging to the public or to the therapists effectively. It's very difficult messaging to get right, though, to be honest. As soon as you say that you're certified organic, and you say that to a medical aesthetics doctor, or they just dump you in the bucket with other hippies. You know, there's this immediate perception that it's low grade product that probably doesn't have a great effect. So increasingly, the ethics of what we do is something that we choose to keep quiet about, but it still is our reason for being. And I guess now more than ever, the drive is to beat the synthetic competitors on pure results, while maintaining our ethics. And to be honest, there haven't been that many instances where we've had a fork in the road where we've gone, oh, well, if we do this, it's going to work for the client, but we're certified organic, so we can't. So, you know, I think if you look at skin health in the long term, you don't find many conflicts with internal ethics.
Yeah. You know, you touched on organic versus where you are now in terms of microbiome skincare. So there's definitely a thought that organic is natural but kind of doesn't have any efficacy in it. But actually, the idea of microbiome skincare kind of brings that together quite nicely, because you're not using synthetic products. You're mimicking the body's natural or the skin's natural systems.
Yeah, I think there was definitely a shift in our underlying thinking when. And we did have to reformulate, for the microbiome. So in 2010, we took the pain and reformulated the line. Thank goodness we didn't have to come off a non-organic base when we did that. If we were, I don't know, a skincare company that had been around for 50 years, we would have been using a whole lot of microbiome unfriendly stuff, and we would have had to make really big shifts in the formulations. Coming off an organic base, most of it was in place. It's not like, there were shifts guaranteed, but most of the underpinning function behind supporting the microbiome was already there from an organic framework. Look, we've come a long way since then, but yeah, I'm very grateful not to have had to come off a petrochemical base.
Yeah. And for you, obviously you're looking at long-term skin health. The industry sometimes isn't. Now, and clients want to see short-term results. So, in your opinion, how do you feel about the industry and its, are there other brands that are, in your space that are interested in long-term health, or is it predominantly everyone just, here for the quick fix?
Yeah. Things that do crop up. I mean, there are choices for formulators, and there's very little accountability. So who's looking 10 years down track and going, look, you're battling with hormone levels at this point, and, menopause has come early for you. I think this might have been due to a skincare product that you were using 10 years ago. I mean, there's no accountability there, right? There's no one, that conversation's not happening. So I guess, and I mean, phthalates are a perfect example there to digress slightly. I mean, those definitely interfere with hormone function at a very, very high level. They reduce testosterone, and that results in reduced sperm quality for men. It results in earlier menopause for women. And if a woman's exposed while she's pregnant, the impacts on the fetus are not great. And they're linked to breast cancer and they're linked to thyroid cancer, but the FDA still deems them safe and claims that they don't pose a safety risk. Those aren't listed in an INCI list on the back of the product. The cosmetics industry won a case that allowed them to put them in with the descriptor fragrance or parfum. So people can't even avoid them if they want to, because anything with that parfum label,
that's sort of hidden under that label.
Yeah, and often you see,
it's scary.
What we've seen is that parfum, raising up, higher and higher in the INCI list, meaning that they're there sometimes at 3-4%, because they are actually, I mean, they're used as fragrance extenders. So, when you put a product on and you can still smell it at lunchtime, guaranteed that's got phthalates. It's, so. I don't know, how badly do we want to spell pretty? But they also, the phthalates also have a feel impact. The product has better bounce. It applies in a more smooth and appealing way. And I think that comes down to how people evaluate product. You hand a person a jar of moisturizer and say, "What do you think?" They will take it, put it on the back of their hand, and smell it. And that's the test. They'll then give you an opinion. If that's going to be the way that people evaluate product, then adding phthalates makes good sense, right? Like you want that bounce, you want the perfect feel. And yeah, I mean, it sounds depressing, like that these things are still used. It's just, I don't see why. I wouldn't sleep at night knowing that we were doing that. I don't care if it drives product loyalty, because, I mean, so obviously if you've been applying this estrogen mimic to skin every day and you stop, skin has a bit of a fallout, right? Like it's reduced its own estrogen production. because this foreign estrogens coming in a regular way. And then when you stop, your skin looks pretty bad for a while. And you might have some pretty serious fallout. So that kind of locks people into using your product. But, honestly, I think, if I was going to do that sort of thing, I don't know, maybe I probably would have got into heroin dealing rather. It seems like a more lucrative, if you've got no morals.
Well, you don't feel strongly about it at all. No. But I mean, that's quite something. When you talk about ethics before profit, maybe just tell us exactly, because you're talking a little bit about that now, and you've talked about ethics before product quite a lot, before profit, quite a lot in your business. Yeah. So, how do you approach your formulations?
So we don't cost formulations. We just build product for efficacy and for long-term skin health. And obviously, in the case with phthalates, we're not prepared to sacrifice the client's long-term other health, and go down with great skin, but 4 kinds of cancer is not a great idea. So, we won't make decisions like that on behalf of the client that we wouldn't make for ourselves. And I think that it allows the company to operate almost in an academic institution kind of way, where we do research, find the best outcome, and take it to market. Look, the company has to be sustainable, but it doesn't have to pay for a private jet and an island. It can operate as a genuine alternative, as a real alternative that considers the supply chain, that considers the end client's health, and looks at all of it in what I believe is a sensible way.
Okay, so we know that you formulate with ethics, which is great. But how do you know your products are safe, and how do you go about ensuring both efficacy and safety?
From the client's point of view, short of becoming a chemist, it's like you don't really know, right? We see it all the time. It's this, you have a list of doesn't contain, no parabens, no sulfated surfactants, and then you look at the ingredients list, and there are alternatives used that are worse, often. And I guess it's for the poor client at the end of all of this, it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. It's like, I dodged that bullet, and that bullet because the product said it didn't contain it, but then it contained a whole lot of other things. So what we did, and by the way, there's a really good resource. It's called the Environmental Working Group, EWG, and they've I think it's called Skin Deep, their platform, and you can go to any ingredient and find it'll get a score between 0 and 10. And actually a hell of a lot of products are listed on there. And you can go and look at your product and go, okay, most of my ingredients are 1 to 3, but then there's this one that's 7, or then that's a bit of a concern. So that's a really good resource for clients to for end consumers to look at. But we were looking for a way really to convey safety that took all of that work away from the clients. So the way we thought we'd do that is by certifying organic, and we ended up in the hippie bucket. So I mean, but with regard to the organic standards, there are 2 main standards in the world at the moment. There's the Cosmos standards, which cover the whole of Europe and Australia, and partially here. And they're the USDA standards that cover the US. The Cosmos standards are crafted for the personal care industry, whereas the USDA have just taken the food standards and applied them. There are holes in both of those, but definitely more holes in the US version. They control the first 70% of the product quite tightly, meaning that 70% of your product has to be organic. And they sort of walk away after that. There's not a huge amount of control over the other ingredients that are used. So I guess if I had to pick between those, as a client, I'd pick the Cosmos standards. And yeah, I think they've been sensible. Those standards about how ingredients are crafted and stuck to green chemistry principles that are environmentally sensible, but indirectly have looked after clients' long-term health outcomes also. So even as far as packaging, for example, they won't allow certain kinds of packaging that might leach into the product. And I think those organic standards are considered. Yeah.
In terms of the US one, though, if you were talking about 70% being organic and the rest being like what you want, it's not really organic then, is it? Because you can almost get away with the idea of putting just the right amount of organics in it, and then you talk about whack-a-mole, but smacking it with something synthetic, and you'd get away with being told it's organic on the label.
Yes, yeah,
Sure.
that is. It's a little bit disturbing. It's not. I mean, look, it's not complete carte blanche that you have with the other 30%, but there's certainly ingredients there that I wouldn't agree with. That being said, there are ingredients that are allowed by Cosmos that I don't agree with. So,
And for example?
well, they allow the sulfated surfactants, for example. I don't think those should be used in skincare. They clearly break down barrier function. Although Cosmos would allow them, we would never use them. And that's just one example. Yeah.
And so all of your products, are they all certified organic?
No, that's a really good point. So there are instances where we see upside without risk. I'll give you an example. So our Zemenia oil, for example, is harvested by a community that we have an agreement with. They just can't do the bureaucracy. They can't certify organic, even though these are wild harvested from like really remote space and would certainly qualify as being organic. They can't go through that process. So the products that product is now used in would fall outside of the Cosmos standards. And in that instance, we just go, well, we won't certify that product. There are other instances where we need efficacy. We've done our internal research. Take bakuchiol, for example. To get bakuchiol clean, you have to use a solvent. And EcoCert don't allow the use of solvents other than ethanol and one or two others. You've got to look at what retinoids are doing, at what we're doing, and the gap there. People are going to use retinoids or they're going to use bakuchiol. In that instance, the end product is solvent-free. We test for that. So it's not like we're adding some nasty chemicals to the end client. And we make the call. It's a natural product. It's a natural alternative to what's happening. It's not bad for the long-term health of the client. We see upside. We see limited risk. We'll use it. And the product will be certified natural in that case, but not certified organic.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Off camera, you were mentioning the idea that you would, we know that you take your product formulation seriously, but you would hate to be a multinational formulator. What does that mean and why? I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot, but...
Yeah, I think I would hate to be a formulator, and I mean, trying to formulate in a box like that must be horrendous. How do you make a difference? How do you step out? On one side, you've got a group of shareholders and a boss that's literally under the cosh for profit. And there's only one real way to maximize profit. So the CEO knows he's doing a good job when he drives that profit to the maximum possible number. And that means driving product costs to the lowest possible number. It must be a really, really tough environment. No one's really accountable at the end of the day for the long-term health impacts. I guess it must be a terrible environment to operate in. And I know friends that I studied with have gone into that environment, and yeah, they certainly had worse midlife crises than I did.
So when you're talking multinational formulator, you mean companies that are controlled by shareholders and creating products on a cost basis to create low-cost formulations?
Yeah, particularly in the retail space where there's still some oversight in the professional channel. There's still some oversight, like a doctor, if a product's not working, will start noticing, right? In the retail space, that's a lot less easily controlled. I think there's just this drive to get a product to have good bounce, smell pretty, and move on. Yeah.
In that retail space, do you think it is possible to make a good formulation at a cost that the consumer can afford?
Yeah, it is, but there's a lifespan for those companies. I won't mention the brand, but I got to meet the formulator of a UK natural and like genuinely natural brand, and when you looked at the formulations, respect, they did a good job. But one of the really big players, one of the big five, bought the company, and I actually only met him slightly after the purchase. So he was super wealthy by then, I guess. But and I met him in Hong Kong, and he said it wasn't worth it to watch what was happening to the company. The money wasn't worth it, and that brand no longer exists. And they were a really big brand, like massive sales in the US and globally, in the East as well. So. Yeah, there's a lifespan. When the cost structure of the product doesn't fit the model, resources in the multinational are allocated. I mean, these guys own hundreds of brands, right? So they'll just allocate resource to other brands, and those other brands will slowly erode market share, and those companies cease to exist.
Just getting back to you guys for in your process of formulation, when you're building a formulation, what makes a good effective formulation? What are the building blocks that you use to make sure that something is competitive with the big players?
Yeah, I mean, you've always got to test, and you've got to be prepared to fail. That's another reason that I wouldn't want to be part of one of the bigger companies, is that there's huge pressure to succeed with every project. We fail a lot. I mean, actually a disturbing amount. I mean, we spent 2 years working on a gum that's produced on a comifera tree in Botswana and Namibia. And we really did think that this was going to be the next big prebiotic. It was a polymer of rhamnose. Everything looked really, really, really good for this. And after 2 years of work, we sent it through to Bonn in Germany for testing, and it didn't work. And I probably would have been fired if I was a formulator for a big company. We lost a lot of money there. And I don't think you would have been allowed to take that kind of risk in a big company. Whereas, for us, it's just, geez, it didn't work. It looked really good, but it just didn't work. So shelve it and move on. And I think, that's happened a lot. And it's okay to fail. And the people on the project know that. But yeah, at least you don't get punished for trying.
Yeah, that's probably a really important point, is that you've got to create that environment of safety to do it. Just formulation-wise, though, if you had to say some of your key ingredients, building blocks, kind of things that you look at, things that can shift skin, what do you use? What do you favor?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the biotech ingredients, so live microbes. We've got a whole lot at the moment. We're looking at grass species, non-grass species. We're looking at some filtrates, so ways of concentrating antimicrobial peptides. We're we're looking at a lot of fatty acids. It took us a while to get onto this train, but as you start understanding that the primary food for the microbiome is is sebum, and that sebum is 20-30% free fatty acid, you start realizing that this is going to be a massive driver, and that the choice of those fatty acids is critical. We're doing more and more work on those: sapienic acid, cebullaic acid, and a few others. The short chain fatty acids also. And then the prebiotics. There's this idea that you can just take a random gut prebiotic and throw it on skin, but skin's actually a pretty low carbohydrate environment. So we're pretty careful with how our prebiotics are structured. We do use carbohydrate prebiotics primarily because of the lactobacilli that we use, and we want to favor their growth. But we're looking at prebiotics in a more and more nuanced way now. A lot of oil-based prebiotics, almost putting the control in the hands of the microbes, allowing them to release the fatty acids when they need to. So that's another formulation benchmark, I guess. The underlying pH of the product's a big deal. It's mostly relatively sensible. And this is it's an ethics one, so the sulfated surfactants would come into that. People love a bit of foam, and there are different ways to build that, and there's sensible ways and not very sensible ways, expensive ways and cheap ways.
So building a foam the right way is expensive.
It is more expensive. That's unavoidable. So when we do, under duress, do products that foam, we use glucosides. So it's a fatty acid with a glucose on it. Obviously, that breaks down super easily environmentally, but that is also a hell of a lot milder on skin than a cocamidopropyl betaine or a sulfated surfactant. We've seen a lot of inverted commas soap-free formulations that just default straight back to sodium lauryl sulfate or cocamidopropyl betaine, and honestly, that's not forward movement.
Sideways, backwards. Now, just all of this is in service of, as you say, long-term skin health. So, what is for you and maybe for the company? What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, on the skin health side, I think we've covered quite a bit of that, but I guess there are other ethics that cover more our what we see as our environmental responsibilities. Maybe we might be pushing the boundaries of what we should be doing on this, but I think the organic certification's the one benchmark we use. But then we also, for every 1 kilogram of carbon that we produce, we offset 2 kgs. So that's a net win. And then on the plastic side, the same. So we have to. We package in glass for a reason, because it's not an environmental threat when it's released into the environment afterwards. And it's also recyclable so easily. But the closures are made of plastic, unfortunately. So for every 1 kg that we use there, we do recover 2 kilograms from the ocean and recycle it. And then vegan and fair trade, and at some point, I think we may be trying to please everybody. But there's nothing in there that's been a barrier to efficacy. Perhaps with the exception of vegan, we needed a 7-dehydrocholesterol for our ProSun D product. We needed to give people the starting material for vitamin D so that when they had sun exposure, they could make more because we are limited these days. And the only place we could get that from was from lanolin, which comes from when they wash sheep's wool to make clothing. Lanolin's the fat that comes off, and that's very high in cholesterol, and that's the starting point for this. We've now found an alternative source, so we have switched to a vegan source of the 7-DHC. So we're back to 100% vegan. But there's no getting away from it. We made an exception there, and I felt that was worthwhile. We copped some strife over it, but I think people understood. It's not like, if we were killing animals to harvest this stuff, it would be maybe different. But lanolin, I think people sort of got it. But like I said, we're back to vegan there. Yeah, I don't know if all those certifications are necessary, but I do feel that it's important to treat the people in your supply chain properly. So fair trade seems like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah.
Why would you want to go and extort somebody in the middle of nowhere? It's just not sensible long-term behavior. Yeah.
On that point, you talked about building the company as an alternative to the mainstream and making that viable. So how did you do that, and maybe a little bit about your business model and maybe why you couldn't have done it as a traditional company?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'd like to chat about that sometime. Maybe on a podcast. Is the more entrepreneurial approach to things and how that's panned out. Esse has grown slowly in comparison to some of these supercharged venture capital driven companies. But I am the only shareholder, and it's been tempting in the past. You've got growth opportunity in a new territory, and you've got a shareholder offering you cash, and you can deploy the cash for rapid growth. But that shareholder always comes with expectation and influence. I know what would happen. Particularly in venture capital, they would look at the company. They'd look at the industry GP, the gross profit that's expected. We would fall slightly outside that norm, not on the good side, and the investor would go, well, you need to make shifts. You can't expect to compete when your baseline product costs are too high. And then the pressure would start. And I would be sitting on a board and having to justify my actions. I think, that in a way that would have brought some rigor to the company and would have forced us to fix our internal structures sooner. But it certainly wouldn't have allowed Esse to continue on what I still feel is a quite beautiful path. I'm proud of it. I don't say that easily. But if I've done nothing else in my life, I've crafted one good thing, and I'll die slightly happier because of that. Yeah.
You talk about not being able to please all of the people all of the time. So some key takeaways for anyone listening, thinking about what you've built and, what it means for product?
Yeah, I think, other than price, we haven't had to compromise on efficacy much. And we've always looked at efficacy in the long term. Like I said, our principles are pretty much in line. And I think it's pretty clear that organic whole food is better. And I guess we're doing the skin equivalent of that. We're using biotech and we're using, the cutting edge of what's available, but it's always got to fit in with these baseline principles of long-term skin health and then long-term overall health for the client. And I guess, I use the products and so do my family, and we're pretty hyper about how we view health. So yeah.
And if you had to give people a takeaway and say, why is it better to deal with a company or a group of people where they put ethics ahead of profit, why would you say these products are better?
Wow. Yeah, I think, geez, I guess it's just who you trust. And that's a tough one. It's not very, it's not very easily measurable. Although you should take our products and put them through the EWG site and see what the results are. I'm pretty confident that they'll be fine. But so I think from a basic safety point of view, that's measurable. From an efficacy point of view, I think we're doing good science, and we are measuring that. And the measurement is independent. It's not like we're internally, in a poll of 3 employees, all 3 said the product was fantastic and helped them feel better overnight. But I guess it comes down to who you test. Who you trust.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, is a big point. Just on that point, you have said occasionally that you find clean skincare a dirty word. Just explain a little bit what you mean by that.
It's. I mean, even doing this podcast is slightly uncomfortable. Just the more people talk about ethics, the less ethics there usually are. It's But I think over time. It's that Kurt Vonnegut quote of like, you are who you pretend to be. So you've got to be very careful about who you pretend to be. And, I've been pretending to be this, this bastion of trustworthy efficacy. I guess that's who we've become.
Which is great. But now, to finish, what's going to carry on driving you? What's going to drive you into the future to carry on doing this?
Geez, there's just so much to do. It's I consider myself like super lucky to be around with a groundswell shift like this. The switch from conventional to microbiome skincare is not trivial. It's a massive deal. You're going, it's like gut. They used to view the whole colon as like, a throwaway thing. You could literally cut it out and you wouldn't notice. And now we found this whole new vista, and it's a game changer, and it's going to be a game changer for the next 50 years. And we're right at the beginning of a journey. I mean, the opportunities for delivering results have never been this high. You start pairing AI and new biotech, and there's so much to do. That's what's going to drive the company. I think I think I could very, very comfortably have settled into an academic life because I'm so driven by curiosity and a desire to learn more. But this gives a more tangible delivery route for that new knowledge. It's not just finding it out and writing a paper. It's finding it out and building a product and making it available and seeing how it competes in the marketplace. And I think good products do rise to the top eventually. It just takes time. Yeah.
Takes time.
Yeah.
Anyway, keep innovating. Great chatting again, and we'll chat next time.
Thank you, Geoff.